The flames licked hungrily at the wooden beams above Ethan Miller's head as he stumbled through the smoke-filled cabin. His lungs burned, each breath harder than the last. 3 years ago, he'd found that tiny brown animal in the woods, so small it fit in his palm. Now, as the roof began to collapse, Ethan knew he was going to die. A deafening crash shook the cabin as something massive burst through the burning wall. Not a rescue worker, but Shadow. 600 pounds of muscle and fur, eyes reflecting the inferno around them. This wasn't the puppy he'd rescued. This was something else entirely. "Shadow, get out!" Ethan screamed. But the enormous animal lunged forward, knocking him to the ground as a flaming beam crashed where he'd stood seconds before. What happened next would change everything Ethan thought he knew about the creature he'd called his dog for 3 years. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Ethan Miller had seen enough death to last a lifetime. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with medals he kept in a drawer and nightmares he couldn't shake. The doctors called it PTSD. Ethan called it remembering. When his wife Jennifer died in a head-on collision 2 years ago, something inside him broke for good. The city streets became unbearable. Too many people, too many sounds, too many triggers. So he'd cashed out their savings and bought the old Henderson cabin on the outskirts of Pinewood, Montana. The cabin sat nestled against the edge of the national forest, a good 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. Built in the 1940s, it had weathered countless Montana winters. The wooden structure was simple 2 bedrooms, a large living area with stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch where Ethan would sit with his coffee, watching the sun rise over the pines. For most folks in Pinewood, the isolation would have been maddening. For Ethan, it was the only peace he'd found since Jennifer's death. Pinewood itself was barely a dot on the map. Population 200 on a good day, the kind of town where the diner served the same breakfast special every morning, and where newcomers remained newcomers for at least a decade. Ethan didn't mind. He kept to himself, taking carpentry jobs when the money got low, nodding politely when he made his monthly supply run to town. His routine rarely varied up at dawn: coffee on the porch, work on the cabin or a furniture commission, dinner alone, sleep disturbed by dreams of desert sand and Jennifer's laugh. Sometimes he'd go days without speaking a word to another soul. The silence suited him. The locals had long since stopped inviting him to town gatherings, though Margaret Wilson Maggie to everyone in Pinewood would occasionally drop off a casserole with a firm instruction to "Put some meat on those bones, young man." It wasn't living, not really. But it was existing, and some days that felt like enough. Ethan had found a fragile equilibrium in his solitude, a delicate balance between memory and present. He had no reason to expect anything would change, until that October morning when the first snow dusted the mountains, and Ethan Miller heard a sound that would alter the course of his carefully constructed isolation, a faint whimper coming from the edge of his property, where the yard surrendered to wilderness. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, a whimper, high-pitched and trembling, like something in pain. Ethan paused mid-swing, his axe hovering above the log he'd been splitting for winter firewood. Sweat cooled on his brow in the crisp October air as he listened. There it was again, coming from the dense underbrush where his cleared property met the forest. Ethan set down his axe and moved cautiously toward the sound. 20 feet from the tree line, he stopped. Something was rustling in the fallen leaves. "Hello?" he called. Feeling foolish, whatever was making that noise wasn't human. The whimpering intensified, a plaintive cry that tugged at something long dormant in Ethan's chest. He pushed aside a tangle of blackberry brambles and found himself staring at the smallest, most pitiful creature he'd seen in years. It was tiny, no bigger than a football, with dark brown fur matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Its round ears twitched at Ethan's approach, and when it looked up, he found himself caught in the gaze of 2 shining black eyes, somehow both frightened and trusting. "Well, hello there," Ethan said softly, crouching down. "What happened to you, little fella?" The animal, a puppy, Ethan assumed tried to stand but collapsed back with another whimper. One of its front paws was swollen, possibly broken. Ribs showed clearly through its thin coat. Whatever it was, it wouldn't survive another night in the wild. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't taken care of anything living since Jennifer died, could barely take care of himself most days. The responsible thing would be to call animal control or drive it to the shelter in Bozeman. 2 hours away. The puppy whimpered again, shivering in the cold. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, shrugging off his flannel shirt and gently wrapping it around the trembling animal. It didn't resist, seeming to melt into the warmth of the fabric. "Just for tonight," he told himself. "We'll figure out what to do with you tomorrow." Back in the cabin, Ethan fashioned a makeshift bed from an old cardboard box and a worn blanket, placing it near the fireplace. He warmed some milk on the stove and offered it in a shallow dish. The little creature lapped at it eagerly, then curled into a tight ball in the box, eyes still fixed on Ethan as if afraid he might disappear. "You need a name if you're staying the night," Ethan said, stoking the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the wall behind the box. The puppy's dark eyes reflected the firelight, watching Ethan's every move. "How about Shadow seems fitting?" Shadow responded with a soft sound somewhere between a whimper and a purr, then closed its eyes, apparently satisfied with both its name and its current situation. The next morning, Ethan loaded Shadow into his old Ford pickup and drove into town. Pinewood didn't have a proper veterinarian's office, just a clinic that operated 3 days a week in what used to be the town's barbershop. Sarah Jenkins had moved to Pinewood 5 years ago, according to local gossip. After her husband died, she was the closest thing to a vet within 50 miles. The bell above the door jingled as Ethan entered. Shadow wrapped in the same flannel shirt, now nestled in a cardboard carrier. Sarah looked up from her desk, surprise registering on her face. Ethan had seen her around town but had never needed her services. She was younger than he expected, maybe mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and glasses that kept sliding down her nose as she worked. "Mr. Miller," she said, standing. "This is unexpected. What can I help you with today?" Ethan placed the carrier on her examination table. "Found this little guy in the woods yesterday. Thought maybe you could take a look." Sarah peered into the carrier, her expression softening immediately. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, gently lifting Shadow out. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking limbs, eyes, ears, and teeth. "Where exactly did you find him?" "Edge of my property, where it meets the national forest. No sign of a mother or siblings." Shadow remained remarkably calm throughout the examination, those dark eyes moving between Sarah and Ethan. "Well, he's definitely malnourished, and that front paw has a sprain, but nothing's broken. Probably about 8 weeks old, if I had to guess." She frowned slightly. "I'm not entirely sure what breed he is, though maybe some kind of mastiff mix. The coloring and ear shape are unusual." "Can you tell if he's wild?" Ethan asked, suddenly wondering if he'd picked up something other than a stray dog. Sarah shook her head. "He's definitely a dog, though I'd say he's got some unusual breeding. Nothing to worry about." She smiled at Ethan. "Are you planning to keep him?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He hadn't thought beyond getting the animal checked out. "I hadn't really, because he's going to need special care for a few weeks. That paw needs to heal, and he needs to gain weight slowly. If you're not up for it, I can try to find a foster home. But our options are limited around here." Shadow whimpered softly, those dark eyes fixed on Ethan with an expression that seemed almost pleading. "I'll take him," Ethan heard himself say. "Just tell me what he needs." 6 months passed in a blur of growth that defied every dog manual and website Ethan consulted. Shadow had transformed from the tiny, whimpering creature that fit in Ethan's palms to an animal that now weighed over 100 pounds and showed no signs of stopping. His coat had darkened from brown to a deep black, thick and glossy, with only a small patch of brown remaining on his chest. Those round ears that had once seemed so puppy-like now looked distinctly different. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah said during one of her now regular visits to the cabin. She had taken to stopping by every few weeks, initially to check on Shadow's progress, but increasingly, Ethan suspected, because she enjoyed their conversations. Today she watched as Shadow effortlessly opened the refrigerator door with his paw, selected an apple with surprising delicacy given his size, and brought it to Ethan. "He's certainly not your average dog," Ethan agreed, accepting the fruit with a scratch behind Shadow's ears. "The rate he's growing, he'll be big as a horse by year's end." Sarah's professional curiosity was evident as she observed Shadow. His behavior isn't typical canine either. That problem-solving ability, the way he watches and learns. "Have you looked into wolf hybrids?" Ethan had. He'd spent countless late nights researching everything from Irish wolfhounds to rare Tibetan mastiffs to wolf-dog crosses. Nothing matched Shadow's unique combination of features and behaviors. "Whatever he is," Ethan said, "he's the best thing that's happened to me in a long time." It was true. Shadow had upended Ethan's carefully constructed isolation in ways he couldn't have imagined. The nightmares still came, but now when Ethan woke gasping for air, convinced he was back in the dust and chaos of Kandahar, Shadow was there, a solid, grounding presence. The animal would press his substantial weight against Ethan's side, those intelligent eyes seeming to say, "You're home. You're safe." For the first time since Jennifer's death, Ethan found himself looking forward to each day rather than merely enduring it. That growing attachment made their first run-in with Mason Crawford all the more unsettling. It happened on a crisp spring morning. Ethan and Shadow were hiking along the forest trail that skirted the eastern edge of his property. Shadow, now large enough that his shoulder reached Ethan's hip, bounded ahead, occasionally stopping to look back as if making sure Ethan was still following. The crack of a branch brought them both to a halt. Shadow's ears perked up, his posture suddenly alert. A moment later, a man in the olive-green uniform of the Forest Service emerged from the trees, rifle slung over one shoulder. "This is federal land," the man said without preamble. His gaze moved from Ethan to Shadow, narrowing slightly. "Dogs need to be on leash in the national forest." "We're still on my property," Ethan replied, though he wasn't entirely certain of the boundary line. "I'm Ethan Miller. Mason Crawford, District Ranger." The man made no move to offer his hand. His attention remained fixed on Shadow, who had returned to Ethan's side, unnaturally still. "That's quite an animal you've got there. What breed is he?" There was something in Crawford's tone that set Ethan on edge. "Mixed breed. Rescue." Crawford's eyes narrowed further. "Uh-huh. How long you had him?" "About 6 months. And he's already that size. Interesting." Crawford adjusted his rifle strap, a gesture that seemed unnecessarily pointed. "Well, Mr. Miller, just make sure you keep your dog under control. We've had reports of livestock disturbances in the area." "Shadow doesn't leave my property without me," Ethan said, feeling a defensive heat rise in his chest. Crawford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good to know. I'll be checking back." With a last lingering look at Shadow, he continued down the trail. Shadow remained tense until Crawford was out of sight, then turned to Ethan with an expression that seemed almost concerned. "I don't like him either, buddy," Ethan muttered, resting his hand on Shadow's massive head. "Let's go home." The encounter left Ethan uneasy for days afterward. He began to notice Crawford's Forest Service truck parked at the entrance to various trails near his property. Once, he caught sight of the ranger using binoculars, aimed in the direction of Ethan's cabin. "You're being paranoid," he told himself. But the wariness he'd developed in Afghanistan, the constant vigilance that had kept him alive through 3 tours, was difficult to dismiss. Sarah noticed his tension during her next visit. "Everything okay?" she asked as they sat on the porch, watching Shadow investigate something in the yard. "You seem distracted," Ethan found himself telling her about Crawford, surprised at how easily the words came. He'd grown comfortable with Sarah in a way he hadn't with anyone since Jennifer. "Mason Crawford has a reputation," Sarah said when he finished. "He takes his authority very seriously, too seriously. If you ask half the town—" "It wasn't just that," Ethan said. He seemed particularly interested in Shadow, as if hearing his name. Shadow looked up from across the yard. He'd uncovered something beneath a fallen log and now carried it proudly toward them, a deer antler, weathered and half-buried. That must have been there for years. Sarah accepted it with appropriate admiration. "He's remarkable. Ethan, I've never seen a dog so intelligent." She hesitated. "But surely you've noticed he's unusual." Ethan had, of course. The way Shadow moved sometimes on all fours, but increasingly comfortable standing on his hind legs. His growing preference for fruits and berries alongside the high-protein dog food, the unusual shape of his snout as he matured. But acknowledging these things meant asking questions Ethan wasn't sure he wanted answered. "He's just unique," Ethan said finally. "Special." Sarah didn't press the issue, but the concern in her eyes remained. The first real test of Shadow's nature came 3 weeks later, during one of Ethan's worst episodes in months. It began like they always did with the dream. He was back in the village outside Kandahar, the one where they'd lost Peterson and Ramirez. The dust, the heat, the sound of children playing one moment and screaming the next. The explosion that threw him 20 feet and left him with a purple heart and the guilt of survival. Ethan woke with a strangled shout. The bed sheets twisted around him like restraints, his body drenched in cold sweat. But this time, the dream didn't fade. The sounds persisted, the high, keening wail of someone in pain. It took several disoriented seconds for Ethan to realize the sounds were coming from him. Then Shadow was there, all 200 pounds of him, somehow squeezing onto the bed, his solid warmth pressing against Ethan's side. And something remarkable happened. Shadow began to make a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr that vibrated through his massive chest and into Ethan's own. The rhythmic rumble created a focus point, something for Ethan's racing mind to latch on to. His breathing slowed. The phantom sounds of the explosion receded. Shadow continued the calming vibration, those intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan's face, until the worst of the panic had passed. "How did you know to do that?" Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. Shadow's only response was to rest his large head on Ethan's chest, a weight that should have been uncomfortable, but instead felt like an anchor holding Ethan to the present. That night marked a turning point. Whatever Shadow was, whatever unusual creature Ethan had welcomed into his home, one thing was certain: they needed each other. By Shadow's first birthday, the anniversary of the day Ethan found him, there was no more denying the obvious. Shadow was not a dog. He weighed over 300 pounds, could stand comfortably on his hind legs reaching nearly 6 feet tall, and possessed dexterity in his front paws that allowed him to manipulate doorknobs, jars, and even the occasional tool. His preference for fruits, berries, and honey had completely overtaken his interest in meat, though he still enjoyed the occasional fish that Ethan caught in the stream behind the cabin. Ethan had stopped taking Shadow into town months ago. The stares had become too pointed, the whispered conversations too obvious. Instead, Sarah came to the cabin regularly, bringing supplies and news from town. Her 8-year-old daughter Amy had begun accompanying her on these visits, delighted by Shadow despite his intimidating size. "He's like a big teddy bear," Amy had declared on her first visit, showing none of the fear most adults displayed around Shadow. For his part, Shadow demonstrated remarkable gentleness around the child, allowing her to climb on his back and lead him around the yard in games of pretend. Sarah watched these interactions with a mixture of maternal concern and scientific fascination. "You know what he is, don't you?" she asked Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Shadow and Amy play a complicated game of hide-and-seek in the yard. Ethan didn't answer immediately. The truth had been forming in his mind for months, but speaking it aloud would change everything. "He's a bear," he finally said, the words strangely liberating after so long avoiding them. "Probably a black bear, given his size and coloring." Sarah nodded. "I suspected as much since he hit about 150 pounds. The dentition, the way he moves, his diet preferences. Everything points to Ursus americanus." She glanced at Ethan. "You don't seem surprised." "I've known for a while," Ethan admitted. "I just didn't want to face what it might mean." What it might mean was losing Shadow. Keeping a wild bear was illegal in Montana, as it was throughout the United States. If authorities discovered what Shadow truly was, they would take him away, best case, to a sanctuary. Worst case. Ethan couldn't bear to think about it. "I won't report him," Sarah said, seeming to read his thoughts. "But Ethan, he's getting bigger. People are already talking. Mason Crawford has been asking questions around town about your unusual dog." "Crawford," Ethan muttered. The ranger had made his presence increasingly felt over the past months. His Forest Service truck frequently parked at the end of Ethan's long driveway. Twice, Ethan had caught him photographing Shadow from a distance when they ventured onto the edges of the property. "He's not the only one concerned," Sarah continued gently. "Mrs. Abernathy at the general store told me Shadow frightened her when you brought him in last winter, said his eyes were too knowing and he was too big to be natural." "He wouldn't hurt anyone," Ethan insisted. "He's gentle. You've seen how he is with Amy." "I know that. You know that. But a 300-pound bear is still a wild animal in most people's eyes, no matter how well behaved." The conversation left Ethan restless and worried. That night, he dreamed not of Afghanistan, but of men in uniforms taking Shadow away. The bear's confused eyes finding Ethan's as they dragged him into a cage. He woke with a start to find Shadow watching him from the bedroom doorway, head tilted in apparent concern. "Just a dream, buddy," Ethan assured him, though the knot of anxiety in his chest suggested otherwise. The first real confrontation came sooner than Ethan expected. The following week, he received an unexpected visit from Sheriff Thomas Williams. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up the driveway just as Ethan was splitting wood for the coming winter, Shadow lounging nearby in a patch of sunlight. "Afternoon, Ethan," the sheriff said, climbing out of his vehicle. Tom Williams was a reasonable man, fair-minded and generally well-liked in Pinewood. He'd left Ethan alone since his arrival in town, an approach Ethan had appreciated. "Sheriff," Ethan acknowledged, embedding his axe in the chopping block. "What brings you out here?" Williams's gaze had already found Shadow, who had risen to his full height at the arrival of the unfamiliar vehicle. Even on all fours, Shadow's shoulders stood nearly 4 feet high. "That would be the reason," Williams said, nodding toward Shadow. "Got some concerns from townspeople about your pet." "Shadow's not a threat to anyone," Ethan said, moving subtly to position himself between the sheriff and Shadow. "He stays on my property." "That may be, but I've got a duty to check out complaints." Williams kept a respectful distance, his hand not near his sidearm, but not far from it either. "Mason Crawford has filed a formal report suggesting you're harboring a wild animal without proper permits or facilities." There it was, the beginning of the end. Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Crawford doesn't know what he's talking about," he said, fighting to keep his voice level. "Shadow's just a large mixed breed, unusual, but not illegal." Williams looked skeptical. "Ethan, I respect your privacy and your service to this country, but that animal doesn't look like any dog I've ever seen. Would you object to having a wildlife expert come take a look, just to clear things up?" It was a reasonable request, delivered without hostility, but Ethan knew what would happen if an expert confirmed Shadow's species. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "This is my property, Sheriff. I've got rights." "You do," Williams agreed. But there are laws about keeping certain types of animals, even on private property. His expression softened slightly. Look, I'm not here to make trouble. I've seen how you keep to yourself, never causing problems. But this situation needs addressing before it escalates. After Williams left, Ethan sat heavily on the porch steps, his mind racing. Shadow approached, sensing his distress, and settled his massive form beside Ethan, leaning against his side in a gesture that had become familiar comfort. "What are we going to do, buddy?" Ethan murmured, running a hand through Shadow's thick fur. The answer came from an unexpected source. The next morning, as Ethan contemplated his dwindling options, Maggie Wilson's ancient Buick crawled up his driveway, kicking up dust clouds behind it. At 72, Maggie was Pinewood's unofficial historian and most outspoken resident. She'd been one of the few townspeople who had consistently checked on Ethan during his first difficult year in the cabin, bringing casseroles and town gossip with equal enthusiasm. "Margaret," Ethan greeted her as she emerged from her car, clutching a covered dish. "This is unexpected. Maggie, boy, I've told you 100 times to call me Maggie," she corrected, squinting past him. "Now, where's this dangerous beast everyone's in a tizzy about? I brought him some of my blackberry cobbler." Ethan couldn't help but smile. Shadow's around back, but Maggie, he's not exactly a dog. "Well, of course he's not," she snorted. "Beth Abernathy was in my kitchen for 2 hours yesterday going on about your monster. Said it had eyes like the devil and stood tall as a man. And you still came out here alone. I've known you since you moved to this town. Ethan Miller, you wouldn't keep anything truly dangerous." She thrust the cobbler into his hands. "Now, are you going to introduce me properly or not?" Shadow, perhaps smelling the cobbler, had already rounded the corner of the cabin. He moved slowly, seeming to sense the need for caution around the elderly visitor. Maggie's eyes widened momentarily, but to her credit, she didn't flinch when Shadow approached. "Well, hello there, handsome," she said, extending a gnarled hand. Shadow sniffed her fingers delicately, then made the soft, rumbling sound that Ethan had come to recognize as his version of a greeting. "That's a bear," Maggie stated matter-of-factly, looking at Ethan. "Yes," Ethan admitted, seeing no point in denial, to his surprise. Maggie laughed. "My Harold would have loved this. He was a forest ranger for 40 years before Mason Crawford was even born." She reached out and, before Ethan could caution her, scratched Shadow behind the ears. The bear leaned into her touch like an oversized house cat. "He's still growing," she observed. "Black bear, obviously, though I've never seen one with eyes quite that intelligent." She glanced at Ethan. "You know the town council's meeting about him tonight. Crawford's pushing for a removal order." "What?" Ethan felt a surge of panic. "The sheriff just came by yesterday. Crawford's not waiting for the sheriff's investigation. He's got half the town convinced there's a dangerous predator up here." Maggie's expression grew serious. "I came to warn you, and to see for myself. Now that I have, I'll speak my piece at the meeting. You'd do that for us. This town has become too quick to fear what it doesn't understand." Maggie gave Shadow a final pat. "Besides, any creature that can inspire such loyalty from a man like you must be special indeed." After Maggie left, Ethan found himself facing a critical decision. He could either wait for the town to take action against Shadow, or he could take control of the narrative. After hours of consideration, he made a call to Sarah. "I need your help," he told her. "And I need to borrow Amy for an afternoon. If you're willing." Sarah listened to his plan. Her silence on the other end of the line stretching so long, Ethan thought they might have been disconnected. "It's risky," she finally said. "If anything went wrong." "It won't," Ethan promised. "You know Shadow. You've seen him with Amy." Another long pause. "All right," Sarah agreed. "But I'll be there the entire time." The town council meeting was held in Pinewood's small community center, a building that doubled as the senior lunch site and occasional dance hall. Nearly half the town had turned out, an unprecedented attendance for a council meeting. Ethan stood at the back, listening as Mason Crawford presented his case. "The animal in question is clearly a wild bear, not a domestic dog as Mr. Miller claims," Crawford was saying, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. "Bears are dangerous predators with unpredictable behavior. Keeping one in a residential area, even one as remote as Mr. Miller's property, poses an unacceptable risk to public safety." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Crawford clicked to the next slide in his presentation, showing a grainy telephoto image of Shadow standing on his hind legs next to Ethan. The perspective made Shadow appear even larger than his actual impressive size. "Black bears can weigh up to 600 pounds when fully grown," Crawford continued. "They have been known to attack humans, especially when habituated to human presence. Mr. Miller has no special training in animal handling, no proper containment facilities, and no legal permits for keeping a bear." Sheriff Williams, seated with the council members, raised a hand. "Has there been any incident of aggression from this animal? Any reported attacks or threatening behavior?" Crawford's jaw tightened. "Not yet. But it's only a matter of time. Bears are wild animals, not pets." "Neither are we suggesting removing the animal without proper evaluation," Williams countered. "I've arranged for Dr. Robert Anderson from Montana State University to assess the situation next week." "A week could be too late," Crawford insisted. "What if a child wanders onto Miller's property? What if the bear escapes?" The debate continued, growing heated. Ethan watched as neighbors he had barely spoken to in 3 years argued passionately about Shadow's fate. Some, like Maggie Wilson, defended his right to keep Shadow, pointing out his isolated location and lack of prior incidents. Others, stirred by Crawford's warnings, demanded immediate action. When the council appeared to be leaning toward Crawford's position, Ethan stepped forward. "I'd like to say something," he announced, his voice cutting through the arguments. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Public speaking had never been Ethan's strength, but he found courage in the necessity of the moment. "Many of you don't know me well," he began. "I've kept to myself since moving here, but I want to address the concerns about Shadow, yes. My bear," he added, seeing the surprise on some faces at his admission. "I found him as a cub, abandoned and injured. I didn't know he was a bear then. By the time I realized, we had formed a bond." Crawford scoffed audibly, but Ethan continued. "I understand your fears. I do. But Shadow isn't dangerous. He's intelligent, gentle, and has never shown aggression toward any person." Ethan paused, gathering himself. "I was broken when I came to Pinewood. The war took pieces of me I thought were gone forever. Shadow helped me find them again. The room remained silent, faces showing a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Ethan said. "I'm asking for the chance to prove Shadow isn't a threat. Let Dr. Anderson make his assessment. If he determines Shadow is dangerous, I'll comply with whatever recommendations he makes." Before Crawford could respond, the community center's door opened. Sarah Jenkins entered, followed by her daughter Amy, and, to the gasping shock of the assembly, Shadow himself. The massive bear moved slowly, deliberately, staying close to Amy's side. The 8-year-old had one small hand resting casually on Shadow's shoulder, guiding him as naturally as if he were a well-trained dog. Sarah walked on Shadow's other side, her presence clearly meant to reassure the stunned crowd. "Oh my God," someone whispered as Shadow and his escorts made their way to where Ethan stood. "This is Shadow," Amy announced in the clear, confident voice of a child who doesn't yet understand fear. "He's my friend. He lets me read him stories and never gets bored even when I read the same one over and over." Shadow sat on his haunches beside the little girl. His posture relaxed despite the room full of staring humans. His intelligent eyes scanned the crowd before settling on Ethan with what could only be described as trust. "I've been Shadow's veterinarian since Ethan found him," Sarah added, addressing the council directly. "I've observed his behavior extensively. While I understand the concerns about keeping a wild animal, Shadow displays unique characteristics that challenge our usual expectations. His intelligence and emotional responsiveness are extraordinary." The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, exclamations of fear, wonder, and confusion. Sheriff Williams had to call for order several times before the noise subsided. "This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior I was warning about," Crawford shouted, pointing accusingly at Shadow. "Bringing a wild bear into a public meeting with a child." "Shadow has spent countless hours with my daughter without incident," Sarah countered. "I would not have allowed this demonstration if I had any doubt about her safety." As if to prove her point, Amy wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck in a hug. The bear remained perfectly still, allowing the embrace with what appeared to be contentment. The dramatic demonstration changed the tenor of the meeting. While some residents still expressed concern, many were clearly moved by the sight of the gentle interaction between child and bear. The council, after lengthy deliberation, voted to postpone any decision until after Dr. Anderson's professional assessment. It was a temporary victory, but a significant one. As Ethan led Shadow back to his truck, specially modified to transport the bear when necessary, he felt a cautious optimism. For the first time since the threats began, he allowed himself to hope that he and Shadow might find a way forward. That hope was tested sooner than expected. 3 days after the town meeting, in the deep quiet of a Montana night, Ethan woke to Shadow's urgent growling. The bear stood at the bedroom window, his attention fixed on something outside, his normally gentle demeanor replaced by tense alertness. Ethan joined him at the window, peering into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a flash of movement caught his eye, a figure moving through the trees at the edge of his property. The beam of a flashlight bobbing through the underbrush. "Probably just kids," Ethan muttered, though he didn't believe it. The cabin was too remote for teenage mischief. Shadow's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. "All right, buddy. Let's check it out." Ethan pulled on his boots and grabbed the shotgun he kept for emergencies, not loaded, but an effective deterrent. "Stay," he commanded Shadow, who reluctantly obeyed. The night air was crisp with the promise of coming frost. Ethan moved silently across his property, years of military training kicking in automatically. As he approached the tree line, he heard voices, hushed but distinct in the quiet night. "Just tranquilize it and we'll load it up. Buyers already paid half." "What about Miller? What about him? Bear goes missing. What's he gonna do?" "Report it." Ethan recognized the second voice instantly. Mason Crawford. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Crawford wasn't concerned about public safety. He was planning to sell Shadow to a private collector. Anger surged through Ethan, hot and immediate. He stepped forward, shotgun raised. "That's far enough." 3 years to the day after Ethan found Shadow, the Montana winter arrived with a vengeance. Snow had been falling steadily for 2 days, accumulating in deep drifts against the cabin walls. The wind howled through the pines, bending their tops like bows drawn by invisible archers. Inside, Ethan stoked the fire, glancing occasionally at Shadow, who now weighed a staggering 600 pounds, the size of a fully grown male black bear. Because that's exactly what he was. There was no more pretending, no more avoiding the truth. Not after Dr. Robert Anderson's visit 2 months earlier. The wildlife biologist from Montana State University had spent 3 days observing Shadow, conducting non-invasive tests, and reviewing all of Sarah's veterinary records. "He's definitely Ursus americanus," Dr. Anderson had confirmed on his final day. "But with some unusual characteristics I haven't seen before. His intelligence is off the charts for a bear. The way he communicates, his problem-solving abilities, frankly, it's remarkable." The expert's assessment had temporarily calmed the town's fears, especially after he'd declared Shadow behaviorally atypical in ways that significantly reduced typical wild bear risks. But it had also forced Ethan to confront the reality of Shadow's nature and the precarious legal situation they were in. Following that night when he'd caught Mason Crawford and his accomplice planning to steal Shadow, Ethan had gone straight to Sheriff Williams. The evidence, a recording Ethan had made on his phone of Crawford discussing the sale, was damning enough that the sheriff had opened an investigation. Crawford had been suspended from the Forest Service pending the outcome, but no charges had been filed yet. The ranger had powerful friends in the county government, and the investigation was moving with frustrating slowness. Meanwhile, Ethan lived in a state of constant vigilance, never entirely sure when Crawford might try again. The town itself remained divided. Some residents, like Maggie Wilson and a growing contingent of supporters, had become unexpected allies. Others still whispered that it wasn't right, wasn't natural, for a man to keep a bear as a pet. The debate had spread beyond Pinewood's borders after a regional newspaper ran a story titled "The Man Who Raised a Bear." Wildlife officials from the state capital had sent letters expressing grave concerns about the situation. Ethan had responded by working with Dr. Anderson to implement proper safety measures, a reinforced enclosure that met sanctuary standards, appropriate enrichment activities for Shadow, regular health monitoring. He'd even begun the complex process of applying for special wildlife rehabilitation permits. But the legal pathway was uncertain at best. "What do you think, buddy?" Ethan asked, watching as Shadow delicately arranged his massive form on the oversized cushion Ethan had built specially for him. "Think we'll convince them to let you stay?" Shadow looked up with those intelligent eyes that never ceased to amaze Ethan. The bear made a soft, huffing sound that Ethan had come to interpret as acknowledgement. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Few people ventured up to Ethan's cabin in good weather. In a snowstorm like this, it was virtually unheard of. Shadow was instantly alert, rising to his full height. Ethan motioned for him to stay back as he approached the door. Caution born from months of threats and uncertainty. "Who is it?" he called. "It's Sarah and Amy," came the reply, muffled by the howling wind. "And Sheriff Williams." Ethan opened the door to find the three of them on his porch, snow coating their heavy winter gear. Sarah's face was tight with worry, and the sheriff looked grimmer than Ethan had ever seen him. "What's happened?" Ethan asked, ushering them inside. Sheriff Williams stomped snow from his boots before answering. "County commissioners called an emergency session this morning, pushed through a resolution declaring your bear a public safety hazard." The cold that swept through Ethan had nothing to do with the open door. "They can't do that. Dr. Anderson's report was overruled." Williams interrupted. "Crawford's got friends on the commission. They've ordered me to seize the animal tomorrow morning." "Seize," Ethan repeated, the word sticking in his throat. "You mean take Shadow away, to be transported to a state evaluation facility?" Williams confirmed, his discomfort evident. "After that, most likely a wildlife sanctuary in Wyoming." Shadow had moved closer during this exchange, seeming to sense the tension. He stopped beside Ethan, his massive head level with Ethan's chest. "They can't have him," Ethan said, one hand moving instinctively to Shadow's fur. "This is his home." "That's why we came to warn you," Sarah said. "The resolution was passed without public notice. They're trying to do this quietly, before anyone can organize opposition. Most of the town doesn't even know yet," Williams added. "I'm not supposed to be here. Ethan, officially. You won't get notice until I show up tomorrow with the wildlife transport team." Ethan looked from the sheriff to Sarah, then to 8-year-old Amy, who had tears in her eyes as she pressed against Shadow's side. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked Williams. "You're risking your job." The sheriff removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Because it's not right. I've seen how that bear is with you, with Amy. He saved that Johnson boy when he fell through the ice last month. That's not a dangerous animal." He shook his head. "But I also took an oath to uphold the law, even laws I don't agree with. Tomorrow morning, I have to do my job." The message was clear. Ethan had until morning to figure something out. After they left, Ethan paced the cabin, mind racing. He could run pack up and take Shadow deep into the national forest, but for how long winter in Montana was no time to be living rough, and being a fugitive with a 600-pound bear wasn't exactly inconspicuous. He could fight the order legally, but that would take time they didn't have. By the time any appeal was heard, Shadow would be long gone. As night deepened and the storm intensified, Ethan found himself facing the hardest decision of his life. Shadow watched him pace, those intelligent eyes following his movements with what seemed like concern. "I won't let them take you," Ethan promised. kneeling before the massive bear. "Whatever happens, we stay together." Outside, the wind screamed around the cabin's eaves, rattling the windows. The old structure creaked and groaned under the assault, sounds that had become so familiar over the years that Ethan hardly noticed them anymore. Until one sound broke the pattern, a sharp crack from somewhere overhead, followed by a heavy thud on the roof. Ethan looked up, frowning. "Branch must have come down," he muttered. Shadow's ears perked forward, his posture suddenly alert. He made a low sound in his throat that Ethan had never heard before, not quite a growl, but a warning nonetheless. Another crack, louder this time, then another. The old timber roof, built decades before Ethan was born, was protesting under the weight of accumulated snow and whatever branch had fallen. "We should check that out," Ethan said, moving toward the ladder that led to the cabin's small attic. He had barely reached the top rung when a deafening crash shook the entire structure. A section of the living room ceiling gave way, bringing with it a shower of snow, wood, and a massive pine bough that must have snapped off in the storm. Ethan scrambled back down the ladder as Shadow let out a startled bellow. The damage was substantial. A 4-foot hole now gaped in the ceiling. Snow and freezing wind pouring in. Worse. The fallen debris had scattered burning logs from the fireplace across the wooden floor. "No, no, no," Ethan muttered, rushing to stamp out the embers. But it was already too late. The ancient dry timber of the cabin floor had caught, flames licking up the wall where a log had rolled. Shadow backed away from the fire, his natural fear of flames evident. Ethan grabbed the fire extinguisher from beside the wood stove, but the small canister was woefully inadequate for the rapidly spreading blaze. Within minutes, half the living room wall was engulfed. "We need to get out," Ethan shouted to Shadow over the roar of the flames. "Come on." He grabbed his coat and headed for the front door, but another crash stopped him cold. The burning section of wall had collapsed, blocking the main exit with a barricade of flaming debris. The back door was their only option now. Ethan turned toward it, coughing as smoke filled the cabin. This way. Shadow. But Shadow wasn't following. The bear stood frozen, staring at the advancing flames with primal terror. Despite his size and strength, in this moment he was governed by instinct, and every instinct told him to avoid fire. "Shadow, please," Ethan pleaded, trying to coax the bear toward the back door. "We have to go now." The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Ethan pulled his shirt over his mouth and nose, eyes stinging as he tried to reach Shadow. The bear remained paralyzed, even as the flames drew closer. In a desperate move, Ethan grabbed Shadow's favorite treat, a jar of honey he kept for special occasions, from a nearby shelf. "Look, buddy. Honey. This way." The familiar sight seemed to break through Shadow's terror. He took one tentative step toward Ethan, then another. They were making slow progress toward the back door when another section of ceiling collapsed behind them, sending a shower of burning debris across the floor and igniting the kitchen curtains. Now they were truly trapped fire in front, fire behind, the only clear path leading to the bedroom. Ethan led Shadow that way, knowing it was only a temporary refuge. The bedroom had windows, but they were too small for Shadow's massive frame. "We're going to have to break through the wall," Ethan said, more to himself than to Shadow. The bedroom's outer wall faced the clearing behind the cabin. If they could create an opening large enough, but how? The tools were in the shed outside. The wall was solid timber, built to withstand Montana winters. The smoke was thicker now, seeping under the closed bedroom door. Shadow was panting, distressed, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, buddy," Ethan soothed, though he knew it was a lie. The situation was dire. The fire was spreading too quickly, and help was miles away in the middle of a blizzard. Shadow seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He looked from Ethan to the wall, then back again, then, with a determination that took Ethan's breath away, the massive bear rose to his full height and charged the bedroom wall. The impact shook the entire cabin. Shadow bounced back, momentarily stunned, a patch of fur torn from his shoulder. But the wall held. "Shadow." "No," Ethan cried, seeing blood on the bear's fur. "You'll hurt yourself." Shadow ignored him, backing up for another charge. This time, Ethan heard the crack of splitting wood as Shadow's bulk slammed into the same spot. A third charge, and a section of the outer wall splintered, cold air and snow rushing in through the gap. The opening wasn't large enough yet. Shadow prepared for the fourth attempt, but Ethan could see the toll it was taking. The bear was bleeding from several cuts where jagged wood had torn his hide. "Together," Ethan said, grabbing a heavy chair from the corner. As Shadow charged again, Ethan swung the chair at the weakened section of wall with all his strength. The combined assault did it. A 4-foot section of wall gave way, revealing the snowy night beyond. Ethan could have wept with relief. "Go, Shadow, go," he urged, pushing the bear toward freedom. Shadow hesitated, looking back at Ethan with an expression that seemed to ask, "What about you?" "I'm right behind you," Ethan promised. Shadow squeezed through the opening, his massive body barely fitting through the jagged hole. Ethan moved to follow, but as he did, a thunderous crash came from the main part of the cabin. The noise was followed by a wave of heat and smoke so intense it drove Ethan back from the opening. The living room ceiling had fully collapsed, and with it, a burning support beam now blocked the bedroom doorway. The fire roared with renewed vigor, fed by the fresh air coming through the broken wall. Ethan tried again to reach the escape route, but the advancing flames and falling debris forced him back. A piece of burning timber crashed down beside him, igniting the bed. The heat was unbearable, the smoke suffocating. Outside, Shadow watched in growing distress as Ethan failed to emerge. The bear paced anxiously, his instincts pulling him away from the fire even as his bond with Ethan kept him close to the burning cabin. Inside, Ethan collapsed to his knees, overcome by smoke. His vision was tunneling, consciousness slipping away. His last coherent thought was regret that he wouldn't be able to keep his promise to Shadow. Then, through the haze and heat, something impossible happened. Shadow reappeared in the opening, pushing back through the hole he'd just escaped from. The bear's fur was singed, his eyes watering from the smoke. But his purpose was clear, with a gentleness belying his enormous size. Shadow grasped the back of Ethan's coat in his teeth and began dragging him toward the escape route. "Ethan," barely conscious, felt himself being moved but couldn't comprehend what was happening. As they reached the opening, another section of roof gave way. Shadow hunched over Ethan, shielding him from the falling debris with his own body. The bear roared in pain as burning timber struck his back. But he didn't retreat. Instead, with a final surge of strength, he pushed Ethan through the opening and into the relative safety of the snowy night beyond. The last thing Ethan saw before losing consciousness was Shadow's massive form silhouetted against the inferno as the cabin's roof finally collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. Ethan woke to the steady beep of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell that reminded him too much of military field hospitals. His throat felt raw, each breath a painful scrape against sandpaper. When he tried to open his eyes, only one complied, the other was sealed shut beneath what felt like layers of bandages. "He's awake," a familiar voice said. Sarah's face swam into his limited field of vision, her features drawn with exhaustion but her eyes bright with relief. "Shadow," Ethan croaked, the single word sending him into a spasm of coughing. Sarah's expression crumpled. She reached for his hand, her touch gentle against the IV taped to his skin. "Don't try to talk yet. The doctor said your lungs need time to recover from the smoke inhalation." But Ethan persisted, forcing the question past his damaged throat. "Shadow." Sarah's hesitation told him everything. A cold weight settled in his chest, heavier than the debris that had nearly crushed him. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she finally said, her voice breaking. When the rescue team arrived, the cabin was completely engulfed. They found you about 30 feet from the wreckage and unconscious in the snow. There was no sign of Shadow. The monitors betrayed the spike in Ethan's heart rate as the reality crashed over him. Shadow was gone, had sacrificed himself to save Ethan from the fire. The pain of this understanding cut deeper than his physical injuries, a wound no hospital could treat. "They're still searching," Sarah continued, squeezing his hand. "But with the fire and the storm—" She didn't need to finish the thought. A 600-pound bear, even one as remarkable as Shadow, couldn't have survived the inferno Ethan had glimpsed in his last moments of consciousness. Sheriff Williams appeared in the doorway, snow still melting on his uniform. "Good to see you awake, Ethan. You gave us quite a scare." Ethan tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. Every muscle screamed in protest, and a sharp pain in his side suggested broken ribs. "How long?" he managed. 2 days, Williams replied. "Storm finally broke this morning. Search and rescue has been combing through what's left of your place." The sheriff hesitated, then added, "I should tell you, Mason Crawford has been leading one of the search teams." Ethan's good eye narrowed. "Why?" "Claims he wants to help. But between us, I think he's looking for evidence." Williams lowered his voice. "The county commission is already talking about how this proves they were right about the bear being dangerous. Crawford's been telling anyone who'll listen that Shadow probably started the fire himself." Rage gave Ethan strength he didn't know he had. He pushed himself up on one elbow, ignoring the flare of pain. "That's a lie. Shadow saved me. He went back into the fire for me." "I believe you," William said, raising a placating hand. But Crawford's spinning a different story. And without Shadow, the unspoken reality hung in the air without Shadow, either alive or dead. There was no way to prove what had really happened. Sarah helped Ethan lie back down. "Rest now. The doctor says you can leave tomorrow if your oxygen levels keep improving. But you need to take it easy." "Where will I go?" Ethan asked, the question encompassing more than just his immediate housing situation. Without the cabin, without Shadow, where did he belong? "You'll stay with us," Sarah said with a firmness that brooked no argument. "The guest room is already made up." After they left, Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with fire and Shadow's intelligent eyes. In every dream, he reached for the bear but couldn't quite touch him. Shadow always just beyond his grasp, as flames consumed everything between them. He woke to darkness. The hospital quiet except for the distant squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. A figure sat in the chair beside his bed, barely visible in the dim light from the corridor. "Who's there?" Ethan rasped, instantly alert. "It's just me." "Dear," came Maggie Wilson's familiar voice. "Sarah had to get Amy to bed, and I volunteered for the night shift." The elderly woman leaned forward, her lined face coming into view. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Ethan admitted. "What are you doing here, Maggie? Someone needs to keep an eye on you, and I don't sleep much these days anyway." She adjusted the blanket covering him with motherly efficiency. "Besides, I wanted to tell you what they're saying in town." Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to hear it, but Maggie continued before he could stop her. "Crawford's been running his mouth about how this proves bears don't belong in homes, how you were reckless, how Shadow turned on you." Her voice hardened with indignation. "But he's not getting the reception he expected." "The volunteer firefighters who found you are telling a different story." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. "They found paw prints. Ethan. Big ones. Leading away from your body and back toward the cabin. Multiple sets, going back and forth, like something large made several trips to pull you farther from the fire." Maggie's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "And they found something else. Blood in the snow, not human blood. Like whatever pulled you to safety was injured. Hope, dangerous and fragile, flickered in Ethan's chest. You think Shadow might be alive?" "I think," Maggie said carefully, "that a wounded bear in a snowstorm would seek shelter, especially one as smart as Shadow. There are caves in the hills behind your property, old mining tunnels, too." Ethan's mind raced despite his exhaustion. If Shadow had survived the initial fire but was injured, he would need help soon. Bears were resilient, but burns, smoke inhalation, and the harsh winter conditions would be deadly without treatment. "I need to get out of here," Ethan said, trying again to sit up. "I need to find him." Maggie placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're not going anywhere tonight, young man. Sheriff Williams has organized search parties for tomorrow. If Shadow's out there, they'll find him." "Crawford will find him first," Ethan argued. "And then what?" "Crawford isn't the only one looking," Maggie assured him. "Half the town is volunteering for the search, including some who were calling for Shadow's removal last week. Funny how a heroic bear changes people's minds." Despite Maggie's reassurances, Ethan barely slept. By morning, he had convinced the reluctant doctor to discharge him, promising to rest at Sarah's house. Instead, the moment Sarah arrived to pick him up, he insisted on going to the cabin site. "Ethan, you're in no condition." Sarah began. "Please." Ethan interrupted, his voice still rough from the smoke damage. "I need to see it. I need to help look for him." Sarah studied his face, then nodded slowly. "All right. But you stay in the truck if I say so." Doctor's orders. The drive to Ethan's property was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the long driveway, Ethan braced himself for what he would see. Nothing could have prepared him for the reality, where his cabin had stood for decades. There was now only a blackened rectangle of debris, partially covered by fresh snow. The stone chimney rose from the wreckage like a monument to what had been lost. Several vehicles were parked nearby the sheriff's cruiser, Crawford's Forest Service truck, and a half-dozen others belonging to volunteers who were combing the surrounding woods. "Oh, Ethan," Sarah murmured as they took in the devastation. Ethan couldn't speak. The physical destruction of his home was overwhelming, but it was the absence of Shadow that hollowed him out completely. He had lost everything before in Afghanistan, when Jennifer died. But losing Shadow felt like losing a vital part of himself, a connection to life he hadn't realized he still possessed. Sheriff Williams approached as they parked, his expression grave. "Ethan, you should be in the hospital." "Any sign of him?" Ethan asked, ignoring the concern. Williams shook his head. "We've covered about a mile radius so far. Nothing definitive." "What does that mean?" "We found some blood trails leading into the woods, like something injured moved through the snow. But they disappear about a quarter-mile in." Williams hesitated. "And we found remains in the cabin debris." Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. He gripped the truck door to stay upright. "Shadow." "Can't be sure yet," Williams said quickly. "Could be a deer or other wildlife that got caught in the fire. We've sent samples to the lab in Bozeman." A shout from the edge of the woods drew their attention. Mason Crawford was striding toward them, his face flushed with what looked like excitement. "We found tracks," he announced, pointedly addressing the sheriff rather than Ethan. "Big ones, heading east toward the old mining area. Jenkins and his boys are following them now." Williams nodded. "I'll radio the other teams to converge there." Crawford's gaze finally shifted to Ethan, his expression a poor attempt at sympathy. "Sorry about your cabin, Miller. Insurance should cover it, though." "Right. And as for the bear well, it's probably better this way. Safer for everyone." Ethan lunged forward before he could stop himself, his injured body forgotten in a surge of rage. Only Sarah's quick intervention kept him from striking Crawford. "You don't know anything about what happened here," Ethan growled, the effort sending him into another coughing fit. Crawford stepped back, his hand moving instinctively to rest on his sidearm. "I know enough. That animal was dangerous, just like I've been saying all along, and now we have proof." "The only proof," Sarah interjected coldly, "is that Shadow saved Ethan's life while you were busy spreading lies." Crawford's face darkened. "We'll see what the evidence shows. Meanwhile, I have a bear to find." He turned and headed back toward the woods, calling over his shoulder, "Dead or alive?" The words hung in the frigid air, a threat that sent ice through Ethan's veins. Crawford wasn't looking for Shadow to rescue him. He was hunting him. "I have to find Shadow first," Ethan said, pushing away from the truck despite the pain racking his body. "Before Crawford does." The search for Shadow stretched into its third day, hampered by fresh snowfall that covered any remaining tracks. Ethan, against medical advice, had joined the search parties each day, pushing his injured body far beyond its limits. Each evening, he returned to Sarah's house more exhausted and despondent than the day before. "You need to rest," Sarah insisted as she changed the bandages on his burns. They sat in her warm kitchen, the domestic normalcy a stark contrast to the desperate search consuming Ethan's every waking thought. "You won't be any help to Shadow if you collapse out there." Ethan barely heard her. His mind was fixed on a series of caves they'd discovered in the hills east of his former cabin. Local lore held that they'd been used by bootleggers during Prohibition, a maze of natural chambers and man-made tunnels. If Shadow had sought shelter anywhere, those caves seemed the most likely place. The problem was Crawford thought so too. Crawford. The ranger had focused his search teams in that area, making it difficult for Ethan to conduct his own investigation without confrontation. "I think Crawford knows something," Ethan said, wincing as Sarah applied ointment to a particularly painful burn on his forearm. "He's too confident, too focused on those caves." Sarah paused, her hands gentle against his injured skin. "Sheriff Williams radioed while you were in the shower. The lab results came back on those remains they found in the cabin." Ethan's heart froze. "And not bear," Sarah said quickly. "Deer, most likely. An animal that was caught in the collapse." The relief that flooded through him was so intense it left him lightheaded. So Shadow could still be alive. "It's possible," Sarah agreed, though her tone suggested she didn't want him getting his hopes too high. "But Ethan, even if he survived the fire, he's been out in freezing temperatures for 3 days, likely injured." She didn't need to finish. Without medical attention, even a creature as resilient as Shadow couldn't survive indefinitely with serious burns or smoke damage to his lungs. A small voice from the doorway interrupted them. "Is Shadow coming home?" Amy stood there in her pajamas, her expression caught between hope and fear. The little girl had been devastated by Shadow's disappearance, though she'd tried to be brave for Ethan's sake. "We're still looking for him, sweetheart," Sarah answered when Ethan couldn't find his voice. Amy crossed the kitchen and climbed onto Ethan's lap, careful to avoid his injuries. "I had a dream about Shadow," she said, looking up at him with solemn eyes. "He was in a dark place, waiting for you to find him." Ethan hugged her close, his throat tight. "Did he say where this dark place was?" Amy shook her head. "But there was water. I could hear it dripping." After Sarah had tucked Amy into bed, Ethan spread a topographical map of the area on the kitchen table. The old mining tunnels were marked with dotted lines, many of them intersecting with natural cave systems in the limestone hills. "Underground springs," he muttered, tracing a blue line that ran beneath one section of the caves. That would explain the water Amy heard in her dream. "Ethan," Sarah said gently, "it was just a dream." "Maybe," he conceded. "But these caves near Thompson Creek, they're the only ones with a water source. Crawford's been focusing on the eastern tunnels, but these northern ones make more sense if Shadow was looking for water." Sarah studied the map, her scientific mind engaging despite her skepticism. "The northern entrance is less accessible. Most people don't even know it's there. But Shadow might have found it," Ethan said. the first real hope he'd felt in days kindling in his chest. He always had an uncanny sense for finding water. Early the next morning, before Crawford's teams had even assembled, Ethan and Sarah set out for the northern caves. Sheriff Williams, informed of their plan, had agreed to keep Crawford occupied with a thorough search of the eastern tunnels. "Just be careful," the sheriff had warned. "Those old mines aren't stable, especially after all the snow we've had." The northern entrance was exactly as difficult to access as Sarah had predicted. They had to leave her truck a half-mile away and hike through deep snow, climbing steadily upward along a narrow game trail. Ethan's injuries protested with every step, but he pushed through the pain, driven by the increasingly desperate need to find Shadow. The cave mouth, when they finally reached it, was barely visible, a dark slash in the hillside, partially concealed by a fallen pine. If not for the tracks leading into it, they might have missed it entirely. "Those are bear tracks," Sarah confirmed, crouching to examine the impressions in the snow. "Large ones, and recent. The edges are still sharp despite yesterday's flurries." Ethan's heart raced. "Shadow," he breathed, already moving toward the entrance. "Wait!" Sarah caught his arm. "We need to be careful. If it is Shadow in there, he's likely injured and frightened. Even the gentlest animal can be dangerous when wounded." She was right. Of course. Ethan forced himself to slow down, to think. From his pack, he retrieved a powerful flashlight and the jar of honey he'd brought as an offering, the same trick that had lured Shadow through the burning cabin. The cave entrance opened into a low tunnel that forced them to crouch as they advanced. The temperature dropped immediately, though it was still warmer than the winter air outside. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing limestone formations and the occasional remnant of old mining operations, a rusted rail, a rotting support beam. "There's the water," Sarah whispered, pointing to a small stream that ran along one side of the tunnel, just like in Amy's dream. They followed the stream deeper into the cave system. The tunnel gradually widened into a series of chambers, some natural, others clearly expanded by human hands decades ago. In one, they found signs that something large had rested there, a depression in the soft earth, tufts of black fur caught on a jagged rock. "He was here," Ethan said, hope and fear warring in his voice. "But he moved on." They pressed forward, calling Shadow's name softly as they went. The cave system was more extensive than Ethan had realized, branching into multiple tunnels and chambers. They marked their path with small cairns of stones, wary of becoming lost in the underground maze. In the fourth chamber, they found blood-dark smears on the limestone floor, leading toward a narrow passage that descended deeper into the earth. "That's a lot of blood," Sarah murmured, her medical training evident in her concerned assessment. "Whatever left this is seriously injured." Ethan knelt beside one of the smears, his hand hovering over it as if he could somehow connect with Shadow through this grim evidence of his suffering. "We're close," he said. "I can feel it." The narrow passage opened suddenly into the largest chamber yet, a cathedral-like space where stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone icicles. Their flashlights couldn't reach the far walls, the beams swallowed by the immense darkness. "Shadow," Ethan called, his voice echoing. "It's me, buddy. It's Ethan." Something moved in the darkness beyond their lights. A shuffling sound, then a low, pained whimper that Ethan would have recognized anywhere. Shadow. He rushed forward, Sarah close behind him. Their flashlights finally found him, huddled against the far wall of the chamber. The great bear was a shadow of his former self, his magnificent fur singed and matted with blood in places. One ear was badly burned, and a terrible wound across his flank still seeped blood onto the stone floor. But he was alive. Those intelligent eyes, though clouded with pain, fixed on Ethan with unmistakable recognition. "Oh, Shadow," Ethan choked out, moving slowly closer. "I found you. I finally found you." Shadow made a weak attempt to rise, then collapsed back with a groan that broke Ethan's heart. Sarah was already assessing the injuries with a professional eye, her expression grave. "He's in bad shape. Ethan, burns, probable smoke inhalation, and that wound on his side looks infected. He needs medical attention immediately." Ethan knelt beside his friend, gently stroking the uninjured parts of Shadow's massive head. The bear leaned into his touch with a trust that defied his wild nature. "We'll get you help," Ethan promised. "Just hang on, buddy." Sarah was already on her satellite phone, explaining the situation to Sheriff Williams. "We need Dr. Anderson," Ethan heard her say, "and a way to transport a severely injured bear." Shadow's breathing was labored, each inhale a visible struggle. Ethan opened the honey jar, offering a small taste on his fingers. Shadow managed a weak lick, but showed none of his usual enthusiasm for the treat, a worrying sign of just how badly he was suffering. "Help is coming," Ethan assured him, settling on the cold stone floor to wait, one hand resting protectively on Shadow's head. "I'm not leaving you again." Neither of them heard the footsteps approaching from a different tunnel entrance. Not until a beam of light cut through the darkness and a familiar voice broke the silence. "Well, isn't this touching?" Mason Crawford stood at the edge of the chamber, rifle in hand, his expression a disturbing mixture of triumph and disdain. "I've been tracking this beast for 2 days, he said, moving closer. "Should have known you'd find him first. Miller, you two always did have an unnatural connection." Ethan rose slowly, positioning himself between Crawford and the injured bear. "Put the rifle down. Crawford, Sheriff Williams is sending help." Crawford's laugh echoed off the stone walls. "Help for what, to save a dangerous wild animal that should have been put down months ago." He raised the rifle to his shoulder, sighting along the barrel. "Step aside. I'm doing what should have been done from the beginning." "If you shoot him," Ethan said, his voice deadly calm, "you'll have to shoot me first." 10 months after the fire, Ethan sat on the porch of his newly rebuilt cabin, watching Shadow amble across the enclosed 3-acre sanctuary that now occupied what had once been his backyard. The massive bear moved with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of that terrible night. But his coat had grown back glossy and full, covering most of the scars from his burns. "He's looking good today," Sarah observed, joining Ethan on the porch swing, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She passed one to him, their fingers brushing in a gesture that had become comfortably familiar. "Dr. Anderson says he's at optimal weight now," Ethan agreed, accepting the mug gratefully. "Though he's still trying to convince me that Shadow needs to cut back on honey." Sarah laughed. the sound carrying across the clearing to where Shadow was investigating a hollow log that had been filled with hidden treats, part of the enrichment program Dr. Anderson had designed for him. Good luck with that. You can't say no to those eyes. It was true, despite all the changes in their lives. Shadow's ability to get exactly what he wanted with a soulful look remained unchallenged. Those same eyes had played a crucial role in the confrontation with Crawford in the caves, though not in a way anyone could have predicted. That day in the cave chamber, as Crawford had aimed his rifle at Shadow, something remarkable had happened. The injured bear, summoning strength from some deep reserve, had struggled to his feet. But instead of charging or retreating, Shadow had simply stood his ground beside Ethan, those intelligent eyes fixed not on the rifle, but on Crawford's face, as if asking a question only the ranger could answer. The moment had stretched, taut with life-or-death tension. Then, unexpectedly, Crawford's aim had faltered. The ranger's expression had changed, conflict evident in the tightening of his jaw, the widening of his eyes, his, "What are you waiting for?" Ethan had asked, still positioned protectively in front of Shadow despite the bear's attempt to stand beside him. Crawford's answer had been interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Williams and Dr. Anderson, alerted by Sarah's call. The confrontation had ended not with violence, but with Crawford lowering his rifle, a decision that had surprised everyone, perhaps even Crawford himself. What followed had been a blur of activity: the complex rescue operation to get Shadow out of the caves, the emergency veterinary treatment, the media attention that descended on Pinewood when word spread about the bear who had saved his owner from a fire. The national coverage had brought unexpected consequences. Wildlife organizations across the country had weighed in on Shadow's case. Some demanded he be relocated to a traditional sanctuary. Others saw an opportunity to study the unique bond between man and bear. Donations had poured in from people touched by the story, enough to rebuild Ethan's cabin and construct a proper sanctuary enclosure for Shadow. Most surprisingly, the county commissioners who had once ordered Shadow's removal now proudly proclaimed Pinewood the home of America's heroic bear. Tourism had increased, bringing much-needed revenue to the small town. Even Crawford had eventually admitted, during his plea deal hearing for the attempted poaching operation, that he'd been wrong about Shadow. "I couldn't do it," he'd testified, explaining why he'd lowered his rifle in the cave. "The way that bear looked at me, not like an animal, but like he understood everything, like he was asking if this was really who I wanted to be." The legal battle over Shadow's status had eventually been resolved with a unique compromise. The property was designated as the Shadow Bear Wildlife Education Center, with Ethan as primary caretaker and Dr. Anderson as scientific advisor. Shadow remained where he belonged, but his story now served to educate the public about wildlife conservation and the complex relationship between humans and the natural world. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, nudging Ethan gently. They had grown closer through the ordeal, their shared concern for Shadow evolving into something deeper. She and Amy had moved into the rebuilt cabin 3 months ago, the four of them forming an unconventional but happy family. "Just thinking about how differently things could have gone," Ethan admitted. "If Crawford had pulled that trigger, if Dr. Anderson hadn't arrived when he did." Sarah squeezed his hand. "But he didn't. And they did. Sometimes things work out the way they're supposed to." Across the sanctuary, Shadow had discovered the honeycomb that Amy had hidden for him earlier that morning. His delight was evident in the way he carefully extracted it from its hiding place, sitting back on his haunches to enjoy the treat with obvious relish. "Dad, Sarah, look what I found," Amy's voice called from inside the cabin. She burst onto the porch, clutching a framed photograph. It was in that box of stuff Mr. Williams saved from the old cabin. Ethan took the slightly smoke-damaged frame. Inside was a photograph he'd forgotten existed, taken by Sarah during Shadow's first year, when he was still small enough to sit on Ethan's lap. In the image, both man and bear were looking at the camera, their expressions uncannily similar, cautious but hopeful, as if both were just beginning to believe in second chances. "I remember that day," Sarah said softly. "It was the first time I saw you really smile since I'd met you." Amy leaned against Ethan's side, studying the photo. "Shadow was so tiny. I can't believe he was ever that small." "Hard to believe," Ethan agreed, his throat tight with emotion. "But I have the photographic evidence right here." Shadow, perhaps sensing he was a topic of conversation, ambled toward the porch, his massive form moving with surprising grace despite his old injuries. He stopped at the edge of his enclosure, separated from the porch by a decorative but sturdy fence, a necessary concession to regulations, though Shadow had shown no inclination to wander far from home. "Look, Shadow," Amy called, holding up the photograph. "It's baby you." The bear regarded the image with what appeared to be genuine interest, those intelligent eyes moving from the photograph to Ethan and back again. Then he made the soft huffing sound that they had all come to recognize as his version of laughter. Ethan felt a familiar wave of wonder at the creature who had changed his life so completely. Not just a pet, not just a wild animal, but something in between, a being who had chosen, against all natural instinct, to form a bond that transcended species. "You know," Ethan said, looking from Shadow to Sarah to Amy, "when I found him that day in the woods, I thought I was rescuing a lost dog." He shook his head, smiling at the memory of his own naivety. "Turns out he was rescuing me. I just didn't know it yet." Shadow made his rumbling sound of agreement, reaching a massive paw toward them in what had become his customary greeting. Ethan reached back, their ritual connection a reminder of all they had overcome together. The small family sat in contented silence as the Montana sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. In the sanctuary, other rescued wildlife, 2 orphaned fox kits, and a one-winged owl went about their evening routines. The Shadow Bear Wildlife Education Center was growing, becoming exactly what Dr. Anderson had envisioned, a place of healing for both animals and humans. Tomorrow would bring visitors a school group from Bozeman eager to learn about bears and conservation. Ethan would tell Shadow's story again, showing the photograph of the tiny cub he'd mistaken for a puppy, explaining how the most extraordinary journey of his life had begun with a simple act of kindness, but tonight belonged just to them, man and bear, bound by a friendship that defied explanation, but whose truth was evident to anyone who saw them together. A reminder that sometimes the most profound connections come in the most unexpected forms. When Ethan Miller found that tiny brown animal in the Montana woods, he thought he was saving a lost puppy. Little did he know, He was actually rescuing a black bear cub who would one day save his life in return. Folks, this isn't just a tale about a man and a bear. It's about how healing comes from the most unexpected places. Many of us have known deep loss and loneliness like Ethan experienced after his military service and the death of his wife. We've felt that emptiness that seems impossible to fill. But life has a way of sending us exactly what we need, even when it comes in a package we don't recognize at first. Shadow reminded Ethan how to care again, how to open his heart despite the risk of loss. Their story shows us that it's never too late for a second chance, never too late to find connection and purpose. Whether you're dealing with retirement, loss of loved ones, or just wondering about your place in the world now, remember Ethan and Shadow. Remember that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as challenges, and that the courage to care despite all risks is what makes life worth living. At any age,